Hello, we're now going to do the second question in the practice exam. Install the latest version of Server and set it up. So I'm going to File, Import an appliance, go and get an appliance from my external drive, which is the VBox templates, and it's the 2019 server sysprepped. I might just check to see I don't have that on a local drive rather than an external drive, because that would make it faster. Do I have? Yes, I do have VBox templates locally. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll actually take it from the local drive rather than the external drive. Okay, so let's browse again. Go to Drive C, down to the VBox templates, and pick the Server 2019. Okay, we'll go next. We're going to change the name of this and put P for practice in front of it. 2 CPUs, 4 gigabytes of RAM. Yeah, that'll probably be okay. And we'll change the name of the disk here so that it's P server 2019.vdi. So it's going to be the same as what the name of the machine is. And I'm going to change the group that it's actually in. And I'm going to put it into the practice assessment group. And I'm going to change so it gets a new MAC address for the network card, and go import. Okay, so while this is happening, we won't be able to do anything else. This is got a 150 gigabyte drive, and it's using about 10 gigabytes out of that, so I would say this thing will limp along until it gets to about 6 or 7%, and then it'll shoot across to 99 and stop. So I'm just going to pause this video for the moment until we get to that point. Okay, so we can see here now that we've pulled in the server, and so we need to set the IP address and gateway addresses, and then install the Active Directory role. Okay, so first thing we need to do is make sure that it's plugged into the correct networking device. By default, any new virtual machine will always be NAT. So if you click on NAT, I need to change that to an internal network called Switch 1. As per our logical network diagram here, it's plugged into Switch 1. Okay, so let's power this up. Because this was a sysprepped image, we'll have to run through a little mini setup. So now it's just done a reboot. That's part of it. I think it's probably just changed the graphics drive is what it's done. Yeah, a bit of screen tearing there. That shows me that we've actually got the VirtualBox graphics driver installed. Okay, so now we just Australia, English Australia, that's okay. Next. We accept. Administrator, we put in our usual password. Okay. Right control is the host key, as you can see down the bottom here. So right control and the delete key will inject a Control-Alt-Delete into this virtual machine. You can see that from the input keyboard. Insert a Control-Alt-Delete is the host key plus the delete key. So if I go right control and delete, it injects the Control-Alt-Delete. We type in that password. And the first thing that the server will do is bring up the server manager. Okay, let's move this to one side so we can see what we need to do. I normally just get rid of this. And in here we need to install the Active Directory role. Actually, we need to set the IP addresses first. Okay, so to do that we go to the local server and it's learning about it there. It's currently a DHCP address. We need that to be a static 192.168.10.3. So let's change that. Right mouse click properties. Look at, I normally turn off quality of service and IP version 6 for things like this. So IP version 4, look at properties, set the following IP address of 192.168.10.3. Default subnet mask, and our gateway is 10.1 there, as per that there. So 192.168.10.1. 10.1 is being the IP address of our firewall. And the DNS server, I'm going to put in the DNS settings as per these machines up here. So those two. Wonder whether I can actually copy that in. Probably not. Oh yes, you can, look at that. Control copy, Control V, and I'm going to hit OK. Close. So that's set the IP address. If we hit the refresh, well, it says we found a new network, we go yes. If we hit the refresh, you'll see this go to the correct IP address. Okay, there's a couple of other things I normally do here just to, so it causes less problems later on. Number one is I turn off the Internet Enhanced Security configuration, and I often turn off the firewall as well. So that's currently on. Let's make it off. And I'm going to do the same thing on the domain firewall. I'm going to turn that off, and also the public network, which is on, I'll turn that off as well. So at the moment I've got all three networks are turned off for firewall. If I hit the refresh button, you'll see this go off. There it is. And the other thing that we probably should do is change the name of the machine here before we promote this thing to being a domain controller, because that's an awkward name to try and remember, especially if you're creating shares and things later on. So according to our network diagram, this thing should be called PDC. Okay, so I'm going to change the name of this, hit the change button, change that to PDC, and hit OK. Now normally it wants to do a reboot after you've changed the name, and I'm happy to do that for the moment. And then after that, what we'll do is we'll promote this thing to being a domain controller. It'll also become a DNS server, and then we'll install the DHCP role as well, which I think is all of these things down in here. Yep. So we finished this first point. We're up to the second point, installing the Active Directory role. and promoting it to being a domain controller. We're just waiting until this thing completes rebooting after changing its name. Okay, inject a Control-Alt-Delete, give it the password. It'll pull up the server manager as it normally does. So after it pulls up the server manager, what we need to do is add roles and features. Oh, sorry, it's still collecting data. You can see the little blue bar still travelling along there. Okay, now try and add roles and features. I normally skip this. Go next. We're talking about the PDC. You can see it's now called PDC, and this is the IP address 10.3. We'll go next, and what we need is the Active Directory domain services. We check that box, and we'll also accept all the additional features. So we add the features, we go next here, and it goes back to the features thing, which we've already done. We go next, and then install. And so this will take a couple of minutes, and that installs all the prerequisite features for this thing to become a domain controller, Active Directory domain controller. Doesn't turn it into a domain controller, but puts all the right features in place, ready to go. What we'll end up with is you'll see a notification here. That notification will prompt us to continue the configuration to turn this into a domain controller by asking us to promote it to being a domain controller, which is what we will do. So we'll just wait for this to finish installing. Okay, so that's finished doing an install. We'll see that its installation has succeeded, so we'll hit the close button. We'll check our notifications, and you'll see here, promote this domain server to being a domain controller. So we'll just click on that. And this wizard, we need to be just a little bit careful here. We're adding this to a new forest. This is a brand new domain, brand new server, everything. We're creating our own new forest. And the root domain name, I'm just going to use my initials, bmw.local will do. Next. Again, we're waiting for the caterpillar to crawl across the top. Okay, so the domain functional and forest functional levels are the lowest server that it will accept. And so the 2016's the lowest one we'll accept in our domain or in the forest. You'll notice also that the DNS is going to be installed by default. You can untick it, but by default it's turned on. And the global catalog server, which is the thing that authenticates people into the domain, is ticked on automatically, and you can't change that because this is the first domain controller in the forest. I'm going to give the regular password. Go next. It gives us a warning about DNS. It's okay because we're creating our own DNS server, so we'll go next. The NetBIOS name is just the non-routable short version of our domain name, so this will just come up as BMW. We'll go next. These directories where they have the Active Directory databases are, that's the defaults. I don't tend to change those. There's a lot of software that we install later on that just assumes things are in those folders, so good idea to leave it. Gives us a summary. We go next. it does a prerequisites check. We'll end up with 2 warnings but a green tick to say everything's okay, which will then allow us to just continue on and complete the wizard and install it to being a domain controller. Again, it's a bit of a waiting game while it does all its stuff in the background. As all you know is the caterpillar crawling across the top of the screen there. That's all you know, things are happening. There we go, 2 warnings. Prerequisites check completed, and we get a green tick. It's all okay to go. So let's go install. One of those warnings has come up. And it's just talking about the one of the settings is a legacy setting for allowing cryptography algorithms compatible with really old version of Windows NT4. And then the next warning that comes up is all about the installation of DNS. Like it can't find an authoritative DNS zone, but it's installing its own DNS server, so that's fine. So again, it's just a matter of waiting until it's finished its stuff. You can see here the DNS warnings just come up, but that's okay because this machine is installing, you'll see up here it's installing DNS and things like that, group policy management at the moment. Okay, so you can, if just keeping track of that line there, it tells you what it's doing. Configuring DNS, so this is where it's now turning this machine into a DNS server. You can see here that after it's finished completing the installation, it does a reboot automatically. So it's going to sign us out and do a reboot. So you can see here as this is rebooting, we've got the screen tearing, which indicates that we've got the guest editions installed, and it's using the VirtualBox graphics driver, and that's why we're getting the screen tearing. It doesn't actually affect it. It gives us a lot of extra features which are handy. Okay, so it's continuing to reboot. Okay, so we'll Control-Alt-Delete and password 9 to get back in. So we've now turned this thing into an Active Directory domain controller, which is the second point. And when we look at the tools on here, you'll see Active Directory users and computers and all, domains and trusts. So this is all this Active Directory stuff. What we do need to do is install DHCP, which you can see is not on that list, but is actually the third point here. So what we do is we go back and add a role or a feature. We go next. It's the PDC, this machine, 10.3. And we wait for it. We spend most of our time waiting for Windows. And then we go down here and we'll pick DHCP server. So we tick that box there, add the feature, go next, 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 and install. And that'll install the DHCP server software, but we'll still need to run its wizard to actually set up a new scope. There'll be a notification to say to authorise our DHCP server to work within a domain environment. So It's important to actually install the DHCP after you've turned it into a domain controller, because you get that authorization that allows it to work within a domain. Previous to that, you can have, if you install DHCP first and then install Active Directory, it can cause some issues. So it's better off installing DHCP afterwards.
You can install with
Okay, so now we've finished installing the DHCP role. So I'll close that. You'll see that we've got a notification and it says complete the DHCP configuration. So we'll click on that and you'll see here authorise the DHCP server on the target computer. So we go next. We're going to use the default account that we're logged in with as, and we're not going to skip it. We want to authorise it into Active Directory. So we go commit. And you can see here that we've now authorised the DHCP server and created the correct security groups. So that's DHCP now installed on our server. So if we look at our tools, we've got DHCP, and that's okay. So we'll open up DHCP, and we need to set up DHCP. So looking at our DHCP here, if we expand out the domain and IP version 4, what we need to do is right mouse click on that and create a new scope. So we create a new scope, it comes up with a wizard. We go next. You give a name to the scope. I'm just going to call it subnet, 10.x, that'll do. Next. The start IP address is going to be 192.168.10, and I'm going to start from say 100 and go to 200. So 192.168.10.200. So the IP addresses of anything that gets an IP address from this DHCP server will be between 100 and 200. We'll go next. We're not going to have any exclusions because we're only using a short range anyway, so I'll just go next. The lease time, so you can change this so that if a client gets an IP address that it has to renew it every 8 days or every 8 hours or whatever time you set. So I'll just leave it at 8 days. Do I want to configure options? Yes, I do, because our client will need to know a couple of things like what the domain name is, what the DNS server is, and what the default gateway is and things like that. So we'll go next. First thing it's asking is where is the router, what is the default gateway, and we know from looking at our network diagram here that our gateway is 10.1. Okay, so anything that's in this subnet here, the way out to the internet is through this router, which is 10.1. So we put in here 192.168.10.1 and we add it into the list and go next. And we know that our server name is called PDC, and then I'm going to hit resolve, and you'll see that it's resolved it back to 192.168.10.3, which is the IP address of our machine. It's already on the list, so we don't need to add it, but if we didn't have anything on the list, then that resolving would have allowed us to resolve the IP address and then add it onto the list. So it's already there, so we just go next. We don't have any Win servers. Wins are really old, like Windows Internet Naming Service. We're using DNS, so we don't need Wins. Go next. Do we want to activate the scope? Yes, we do. So it actually does give out IP addresses, and we'll click Finish. So now we've got a scope, and you'll notice it's a green tick, by the way. And our address pool is from 10.100 to 10.200. We don't have any leases at the moment because nothing's asked for an IP address yet. But when, for example, we put our workstation here and plug it into switch 1 and it's set up for DHCP, it'll request it, and our server, our DHCP server here, will give out the IP address between 10.100 and 10.200. and then it'll lease that address to the workstation, and it'll turn up in this list here. Often you have to press the refresh button here to make it appear, but you know, que sera. Okay, so DHCP is set up and installed, which is this thing here. So now what we need to do is web browse into our firewall and set up NAT on the first network card Ether00 and routing information protocol, or RIP, on Ether01 according to our network diagram here. So we have NAT on our first interface and RIP on our second interface. That's what it's asked us to do. So the IP address that we're going to web browse into obviously is this 10.1, so we're in 10.3. So we can get to 10.1, so we can web browse into that and then set this machine up. So on here, I'm just going to run Internet Explorer, and I'm going to type in, don't want to use the recommended settings, ask me later. You'll notice here it's the Internet Enhanced Security configuration is turned off. Remember, we turned that off. That's quite fine. That just means that we don't have to, every website we go to, have to add it to the list. This stops us from having to create lists of websites that we're allowed to go to. So I'm going to type in 192.168.10.1, and it sometimes takes a little while because the zero shell back here needs to start up its HTTP server, and so you can see here was spinning around, but it's got there. So we're going to go more information and go to the web page anyway. And you can see we've got to our zero shell, and we're going to go admin, and the password is zero shell. And if you have a look at your, you can see above in between the dashed lines on the right hand side, just to the left of my cursor here, user is admin and password is zero shell. Okay, so that's what goes in here. Log in. We're going to remember it for the next time we log in, and it's going to get there slowly. We did get there. Let's maximise it so we can see what we're doing. Most of the stuff that we need to do is in the networking section, so we're going to go down to the router, and across the top here you can see NAT and RIP. Well, they're the two things that we need. We're going to do NAT on, if you remember here, NAT needs to go on our first interface, Ether00. If you look down here, it says NAT on Ether00. So we need to put Ether00 into this NAT enabled interfaces and hit the save button. So that's NAT done. For RIP, it's currently disabled, so we're going to enable it. That's the first thing we do. And then if you have a look down here, RIP needs to be on the second interface, the Ether01. So we take the Ether01 and put it into the RIP enabled interfaces and hit save. Okay, so we've now just done those things as well. So we've done this entire question. So that'll be the end of this video.